The valley was quiet for a breath, yet the kind of quiet that spoke of danger, not peace, and she knew better than to trust it. She kept her rifle raised, eyes straining through the haze where shadows flickered and shapes emerged, only to vanish again. Mason lay weak beside her, his lips moving with words she could not hear, his skin pale like paper, and his blood still seeping slow through the bandages. She pressed her hand to the wound, whispering that he would be fine, though she knew it was a promise she could not guarantee. She was torn between staying low with him and rising to face the storm. But the battlefield rarely allowed choices. From the ridge, a sound rolled heavy like thunder, and she knew the enemy vehicle was still there, circling, like a predator waiting for the moment to strike again. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow, yet she forced her body still, because fear could not rule her. Not here. Not now. A medic was supposed to be calm under fire, and she clung to that rule, even though calm was slipping through her like water through cracks in stone. She steadied her aim, watching the smoke for movement, and the silence stretched until it felt like a noose. Suddenly, the crack of rifles erupted from the left side of the convoy, bullets snapping into metal and dirt around her. She ducked, pushing Mason flatter against the ground, shielding him with her frame. Her ears filled with the scream of fire ripping past, yet she forced herself to lift the rifle over the shattered wall and fire back blindly. The recoil jarred her bones, and she tasted iron on her tongue, but she refused to stop even when her vision blurred from dust and sweat, because if she stopped, they would come closer, and Mason would not stand a chance. The enemy pressed harder, their shouts carrying across the valley rough and guttural. She recognized the rhythm of their advance, trained and disciplined, and her stomach dropped. She had been told ambushes came fast and furious, but this was no rush. This was a hunt drawn out precise, designed to break them slowly. She wanted to believe reinforcements were near that. Somewhere beyond the smoke, friendlies were rushing to their aid. Yet the only sounds were fire and screams fading one by one. She clenched her jaw and told herself she would not break, no matter how dark this valley became. She checked Mason again, his pulse faint, his breathing shallow, his eyes fluttered, and she knew he was slipping away. She gripped his hand hard, speaking to him even, though her voice shook, telling him he was not allowed to quit. Not here. Not now. Not with her fighting for him. She pressed more gauze into the wound, blood soaking through almost as soon as it touched. The kit was nearly empty, and panic clawed at her chest, but she shoved it down because panic saved no one. She told herself she could improvise. She could hold him together with will alone if she had to. The enemy vehicle moved again, its engine growling through the smoke. She peeked over the rubble and saw its turret shifting, searching for targets. The ground around the convoy was littered with broken metal and fire, and she realized if it found them, they would be finished. She scanned desperately for something, anything that could stop it, and her eyes landed on the belt of grenades strapped to a fallen soldier not far from her cover. The sight filled her with a spark of desperate hope, but also dread, because reaching it meant crossing open ground under relentless fire. She stared at the grenades, then back at Mason, and the decision clawed inside her chest. She could stay here, hide and watch the vehicle tear them apart, or she could run and gamble her life for a chance to save his and maybe everyone left. She tightened her grip on the rifle, felt the burn in her muscles and the fear in her lungs, and then she whispered to Mason that she would be right back, that he had to hold on. She touched his forehead once. Then she rose from the dirt and sprinted into the open bullets, tore the air around her. Each one a scream too close to her ears. She zigzagged across the ground, eyes locked on the fallen soldier, her lungs burning with every breath. The grenades glinted dull in the haze, and she dove forward, hitting the dirt hard as another burst shredded the ground where she had stood. She clawed the belt free, fumbling with trembling fingers, then rolled behind a piece of wreckage, clutching the explosives tight to her chest. Her breath came ragged, but she forced herself to focus, because the vehicle engine was louder now, closer. She crawled forward, dragging herself inch by inch toward a better vantage point. Each scrape of her elbows against the dirt felt like fire, yet she pressed on until she reached a slope that gave her a clear line to the machine. Her heart pounded so hard it drowned the noise around her. She pulled one grenade free, yanked the pin, and whispered a prayer she had not spoken in years, then hurled it with every ounce of strength left in her arm. The explosion tore through the air, a roar that swallowed the valley, and she saw fire bloom against the side of the vehicle. Smoke and flame burst outward, metal shrieking as the machine shuddered. She did not wait to see if it was finished. She grabbed another grenade and threw again, this time closer, more desperate. The second blast tore open the hull, and the vehicle erupted in sparks and fire that lit the ridge like a beacon. The noise deafened her, but the sight filled her with a fierce, sharp hope that maybe, just maybe, the tide could shift. She ducked back into cover, heart racing, knowing the enemy would be furious now, knowing they would come harder. She scrambled back toward Mason, each step a battle against exhaustion. She found him still breathing barely, his face pale but alive. She collapsed beside him, pressing her body against the wall, trying to shield him from the fury that was sure to follow. She told him the vehicle was gone, told him they had a chance, though, inside. She knew it was not over, not even close. The valley was still filled with shadows, and the silence after the explosions felt heavier than ever. She clutched the rifle close, listening, waiting, knowing the next wave was already on its way. The fire from the destroyed vehicle burned bright against the haze, throwing strange shadows across the valley, and for a fleeting heartbeat, she thought they might have gained a sliver of advantage, but the silence that followed felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that belonged to hunters just before they closed in. She clutched the rifle tighter, her eyes scanning the smoke that shifted like curtains, hiding and revealing figures that never quite stepped into focus. Mason stirred weakly beside her, his lips moving, though no sound reached her, and she pressed her hand to his shoulder, whispering that she was still there, that he was not alone, even though her own voice shook with the weight of fear. From somewhere beyond the ridge came the sharp whistle of a signal, and then the ground answered with a storm of fire. The enemy had not retreated. They had only been waiting, and now they unleashed their full strength. Bullets tore into metal sparks, leaping into the air, the roar of overlapping gunfire drowning out every other sound. She ducked low, dragging Mason tighter into the hollow of the broken wall, dirt spraying around them as rounds slammed into the earth. Each second felt stretched like wire pulled to the breaking point. She risked a glance over the wall, and her stomach dropped. The enemy was advancing in formation, shadows fanning out through the smoke, methodical, relentless. She knew the convoy was fractured, too scattered to hold against that kind of push. She could see Sergeant Ellis further down, waving soldiers into position, but even from here she could tell they were too few, too wounded, too desperate. The enemy was closing in, and soon there would be nowhere left to hide. She felt the weight of that truth sink into her bones, yet she refused to give in because Mason still breathed, and where there was breath, there was fight. Her kit was nearly empty. The last rolls of gauze soaked, the morphine gone, the antiseptic bottles shattered in the dirt. She looked at Mason, his face pale, his pulse thin, and she fought the rising panic with every shred of discipline she had left. She told herself he could make it if she could buy just a little more time, but buying time meant facing the storm head-on. She lifted the rifle again, pressing the stock hard into her shoulder, ignoring the ache that spread through her arms. She waited for the shadows to move closer because she knew she had no choice but to meet them. The first figure emerged from the haze, and she fired, the shot tearing through the air, the recoil slamming into her, but her aim held steady. Another came and she fired again, each pull of the trigger erasing another piece of the person she thought she was. She remembered training rooms where instructors told her medics do not fight, where they reminded her the weapon was a formality only, yet here in the dust she had become something else entirely. The thought terrified her, but she pushed it aside because hesitation now meant death for both of them. The enemy answered her shots with fury rounds hammering into the wall, shards of stone biting at her skin. She pressed Mason lower, covering him with her body as she reloaded, hands fumbling slick with sweat and blood. The noise was constant, unrelenting, a storm with no end. She tried to focus on rhythm. Fire, cover, breathe, repeat. But her body trembled with exhaustion. Every muscle screamed, yet she forced herself forward because there was no one else left to protect him. No one else left to hold this corner of the line. Then a flash caught her eye. Not far to the right, one of the soldiers from the convoy pinned under a collapsed door. His leg twisted unnaturally. He was shouting for help, his weapon out of reach. She hesitated, torn between staying with Mason and rushing to him, the oath inside her screaming that no one should be left behind. She looked at Mason, pale and fading. She looked at the soldier, trapped and desperate, and the shot still rang in her ears, though the figure before her had already fallen, and the smoke wrapped the valley like a shroud. She did not stop to look back. She only felt the pounding in her chest and the sting of dust in her eyes. The rifle was heavier now than it had ever been, but her hands clung to it because her instincts told her the next moment could be worse than the last, and there was no chance to let go. She pressed herself against the side of a vehicle, metal hot from the sun, and riddled with dents from the hail of bullets around them. Somewhere to her right, someone was screaming for a medic, the cry jagged and desperate, cutting through the chaos. She knew that voice belonged to Corporal Mason, the same soldier who had once told her medics never fight, who had laughed at the thought of her lifting a weapon. Now his voice was breaking, and she knew he might not last if she stayed frozen in place. Another second longer. The decision came like a current pulling her into a river. She darted out from cover low to the ground, rifle clenched awkwardly in one hand, while her kit clattered against her side. Each step felt like it might be her last. The air sliced with fire and smoke that seemed to chase her with intent. She reached Mason, finding him crumpled against a wheel well, blood dark on his sleeve, his eyes wild with shock. She dropped the rifle for a moment, snatching open her kit with shaking hands, but then a new volley of shots forced her down against him, she whispered to him, though she could not hear her own words, and began to work the way she always had. Needle thread, gauze, pressure. Anything to keep the red from spilling out. Mason tried to speak, but she hushed him, pressing harder because she knew silence was safer here. For one breath, the world narrowed to the wound, and her hands knew what to do. Yet her eyes kept flicking to the rifle beside her, knowing it was no longer a choice, but a tether to survival. A shadow moved across the smoke, and she knew they were coming closer. She could not finish the work, not yet. She slid the rifle back into her hands and raised it over the rim of the wheel, waiting for the shape to reveal itself. The first burst cracked past her face close enough that she felt the heat. She returned fire, barely able to see but unwilling to let the figure advance. Mason groaned beneath her, and she wanted to tell him it was all under control, though she doubted every word of it. More soldiers shouted from the convoy, some firing back, some pinned down. The air was thick with commands and curses, and she realized that this ambush was no small skirmish. It was planned precise and intent on leaving no survivors. She felt anger climb into her throat. Anger at being cornered, anger at being forced into this role she had sworn never to play. She wanted to be the hands that saved lives, not the hands that ended them, but survival left no room for vows. She dragged Mason inch by inch behind the axle shielding, him as best she could. The dirt tore at her knees, the kit spilling its contents. Yet she pushed on, until she reached a small dip where the ground folded enough to hide them briefly. She pressed a bandage into the wound and told him to hold it, though. His grip was weak and fading. She reached again for the rifle, scanning the smoke, her breath shallow and broken because every second she expected another shadow to appear. The gunfire slowed for a heartbeat, only to be replaced by the distant crunch of boots on gravel. They were moving in, closing the distance. She braced herself, gripping the weapon tighter than ever. She wanted to believe reinforcements would come, that the convoy would push them back, but the sound told her otherwise. They were surrounded, and the line was collapsing. She looked once at Mason, then lifted her eyes to the valley ridge, and whispered to herself that she would not let him die here, not while she still had the strength to stand. She rose into the smoke legs unsteady, but her aim locked forward. The first figure broke into view, and she fired again, the recoil snapping her shoulder, yet she stood her ground. The world spun around her, but the clarity of purpose held her still. Every shot was a promise that she would carve a path through this valley no matter what it cost. She thought of the stories told in training about medics never firing a round. She thought of the disbelief in their eyes and the laughter in their voices, but here, in the dust and blood, she had become something no one expected behind her. Mason coughed, calling her name in a whisper so faint she barely heard it. She turned, half expecting to see him slipping away, and for a moment her heart nearly stopped. She dropped beside him, pushing harder on the bandage, her mind torn between the healer she had always been and the soldier she had been forced to become. Around them, the battle raged on the noise, unrelenting, and she knew this was only the beginning, and the valley would not let them leave without a price. The valley shook again as another blast ripped through the air, and the ground beneath her trembled as if the earth itself was unwilling to bear the weight of so much violence. She pressed her hands harder into the wound, on Mason's arm, trying to will the bleeding to stop, but blood was stubborn and kept pushing past the cloth. She wanted more time, more quiet, more safety, but none of those things existed here in the haze of dust and fire that wrapped the convoy. Like a trap, voices shouted her name, though she could not tell if they were friend or enemy. Her ears still rang from the earlier gunfire, and the world sounded muffled like she was underwater. Mason groaned again, and his eyes rolled back, and she shook him, whispering for him to stay awake, promising that she would not let him go. She pulled at the bandage, with her teeth tightening it down harder, even as the blood soaked through and her own hands grew slick. She told herself that he would live because he had to live, because she refused to let the field claim him, the way it had claimed so many others. Another shadow broke through the smoke, a figure sprinting low, rifle raised. She swung her weapon up, firing before she had time to think, and the recoil snapped against her shoulder again. The figure dropped, but she did not watch him fall, her eyes already scanning for the next. She realized then that she had crossed a line. There was no going back from this moment because she was no longer only a medic with a kit. She was a soldier who had taken lives to preserve them, and she wondered if she would ever feel her hands the same way again. Mason's voice rasped, barely a whisper, begging her not to leave him, and she shook her head fiercely. She told him she would never leave, and meant it, even if it meant her own death. She pulled him closer, trying to shield him with her body, while she searched the ridgeline for a break, for a path, for any sign that the tide could shift in their favor. But all she saw was smoke shapes and endless fire. It was then she realized reinforcements might not come at all, and the weight of that thought pressed harder than the rifle in her hands. The convoy had splintered, soldiers scattered. Behind cover, some firing, some silent. She saw Sergeant Ellis crouched behind a truck, gesturing frantically for her to move toward him. She knew the distance was too open, too exposed, but Mason could not move, and leaving him was impossible. She shouted, Back, though, her words drowned in the roar of more bullets, and Ellis vanished into the smoke, leaving her with the same choice she had faced again and again: fight or fall, heal or kill. She knew she would have to be both, until this was done. Her arms ached from holding the rifle, but she refused to lower it. She could feel the pressure of exhaustion seeping into her bones, the kind that made hands tremble and thoughts blur, yet adrenaline burned hotter, pulling her forward. She had been trained for endless hours in sterile rooms with bright lights and clean equipment, but none of it prepared her for this: for blood in the dirt, for the smell of burned metal, for the sound of men dying feet away from her. She wanted to scream, but the battlefield stole even that. Then came a sound different from the rest, a heavier grinding from the ridge above. She looked up, and through the haze she glimpsed the dark outline of something larger than men, a vehicle moving slow and deliberate toward the convoy. Her chest tightened, because she knew what it meant: reinforcements for the enemy and a death sentence for them if they stayed pinned. She gripped the rifle tighter and searched for options, for miracles, for anything but the truth. Clawed at her, she would have to move Mason now, or neither of them would survive the next few minutes. She dragged him inch by inch across the dirt, ignoring the sting in her arms and the weight pulling her shoulders low. Every breath felt like fire, every movement a battle against both gravity and fear. Mason tried to help, but his strength was gone, and he slumped against her as she pulled. She prayed for cover and found only shallow dips and broken debris to shield them still. She refused to stop. She told herself that each foot gained was one closer to life, one closer to survival. The vehicle on the ridge fired, and the blast tore a crater yards away, the shockwave knocking her and Mason hard into the ground. She gasped, tasting dirt in her mouth. Ears ringing again, but forced herself upright. She wrapped both arms around him, dragging again, dragging like every step was through chains. Her legs screamed. Her back burned, but she pushed, because stopping meant death, and she was not ready to surrender either of their names to the valley. She pulled him into the hollow of a half-collapsed wall and pressed her body against his, shielding him from view. The battle outside raged louder now. Fire-constant voices shouting commands that blurred into noise. She checked Mason again, his eyes fluttering, his skin pale, yet he was breathing, and that was enough for her to keep moving forward. She pressed more gauze into his wound, prayed it would hold, and raised the rifle A. The night air thickened with smoke and fire, and every breath tasted of ash and iron. She could not remember the last time she had filled her lungs without pain, but she forced herself to stay steady because Mason still clung to life, and the soldier she had pulled from the wreckage leaned against the wall, clutching his mangled leg. Both of them looked to her eyes wide, hollow, desperate, and she knew she could not falter. She pressed the rifle into her shoulder again and watched the shadows grow, closer every step, echoing like a drumbeat of doom. The fire from the destroyed vehicle flickered behind them, casting their shapes onto the ground like fragile silhouettes. She thought of home for the first time in hours of quiet streets, and the sound of leaves in the wind of her mother's voice, telling her she had chosen a path of healing, not killing, and for a moment guilt burned hotter than fear. But the valley reminded her where she was, with the snap of bullets striking stone inches from her face, and she shoved the memory away because memories could not keep Mason alive, and they could not hold the line. She rose higher over the wall, firing into the advancing shapes, each shot a jolt through her shoulder, her ears ringing her, body trembling under the force. Yet with every burst, she saw figures drop into the dirt, and though fear gnawed at her, she realized she was slowing them. Not stopping them, but forcing them to pause, forcing them to bleed. Time. And time was all they needed. Time was survival in moments like this. She crouched again, checking Mason, feeling his pulse faint. But there she pressed more cloth into his wound, whispered that he was strong, that he had to hold on. The soldier beside her tried to hand her his pistol, but his hands shook too much to aim, and she pushed it back into his lap, telling him to save the last bullet for himself, if it came to that. He stared at her eyes wide, but she gave him no chance to argue. She had no space for arguments. Not here. Not now. Not with the enemy pressing closer. She reloaded again, each motion stiff and clumsy, but steady enough, and she waited until the next shape broke through the haze, then fired without hesitation. The storm intensified, the enemy shouting. Louder their rounds, striking harder against the walls around her. She knew they were determined to crush the convoy completely, and her mind whispered that this valley could become their grave. But another part of her, louder, fiercer, shouted that she would not allow it. She would not surrender, even if it meant standing here until her last breath. She had already crossed the line. She could never return to the medic she once was. And so she leaned into the new reality of her blood-stained hands. The minutes dragged like hours, the sky dark above them broken by streaks of fire from weapons and explosions. The heat pressed down, suffocating, and the dust coated her throat. But still she did not stop. She fired again and again until her rifle clicked empty, then slammed another magazine into place, though her fingers felt clumsy like stone. Her body begged for rest, her muscles burned, yet she forced herself forward because Mason stirred faintly every time she whispered to him, and that was enough. That spark of life kept her anchored to this fight. Then she heard something different cutting through the chaos, the distant thump of rotors, heavy and rhythmic. Her heart lurched, but she did not dare believe. She lifted her eyes, scanning the sky through the smoke, and for a brief second she saw a silhouette, large and unmistakable, a helicopter moving fast. She shouted to the soldier beside her, though her voice cracked above the gunfire, telling him help might be coming. The words barely left her mouth when the enemy fire surged louder, as if they too had realized their time was slipping. She rose once more from the wall, reckless, desperate, firing into the shapes with renewed fury. She did not care about recoil, did not care about the sting of shrapnel on her skin. She cared only about holding them back long enough for the sound of the rotors to draw closer. She felt something tear into her shoulder, hot and sharp, and she stumbled back against the wall. But she clenched her teeth and lifted the rifle again, refusing to yield. The soldier beside her shouted, but she silenced him with a look she would not stop, not until Mason was safe. The rotors grew louder now, undeniable above the valley, and a flare burst overhead, casting the battlefield in harsh white light. The enemy froze momentarily, and she seized the moment, emptying her rifle into their line with a cry torn from somewhere deep within her. The ground shook as the helicopter unleashed its own fire, raining down on the ridge, the enemy scattering under the force. She collapsed back against the wall, chest heaving, body trembling, blood soaking through her sleeve. But a fierce, desperate hope surged inside her. Mason coughed weakly, eyes flickering open, and she caught his hand, pressing it tight against her own. She told him reinforcements were here, that they would not die in this valley. Not tonight. The soldier beside her lifted his head, disbelief and relief mixing in his gaze. She wanted to believe. It too wanted to believe the worst had passed, but the valley still echoed with scattered gunfire, and smoke still wrapped them tight. She knew the fight was not over, not yet, but for the first time since the ambush began, she allowed herself to imagine that survival was possible. As the helicopter circled overhead and more shadows moved toward the convoy, she steadied her rifle once more, her body weak, her mind heavy, but her resolve unbroken, because the valley was not done testing her, and she would not be done fighting until the very last breath. The roar of the helicopter above them grew heavier, its blades chopping through smoke and dust, the sound vibrating through the valley like the heartbeat of something massive. She looked up, her vision blurred by blood, sweat, and grit. Yet she saw the faint shape of soldiers fast roping down into the chaos, their figures cutting through the haze like ghosts. Mason stirred against her, his hand twitching weakly, and she gripped it tighter, whispering that he was going home even if she was not. The enemy scattered under the new assault, but not all of them. Some held their ground, determined to finish what they had started. Bullets still tore across the convoy, pinging against twisted steel, and the ground shook with explosions as the helicopter poured fire onto the ridgeline. She pressed herself over Mason, shielding him as dirt rained down, then rose again, rifle steady, even though her arms trembled with exhaustion. She fired into the haze, not to kill, but to keep them away. Every shot a warning, every shot a plea for time. One of the new soldiers slid down near her, crouching low eyes, scanning the field. He shouted that they were pulling back, that they had to move to the extraction point. She looked at Mason, then at the soldier with the broken leg, then back at the battlefield. She knew moving them through the open meant almost certain death, yet staying meant the same. She nodded anyway because hesitation would only make it worse. She slung her rifle across her back, hooked her arms under Mason, and began to drag him again. Muscles screaming, bones aching, but her will refusing to break. The soldier with the mangled leg tried to crawl alongside her but collapsed. She turned, grabbing him with her other arm, dragging both of them inch by inch across the dirt. Her lungs burned, her back felt like it would snap, but she kept moving because there was no other option. The helicopter thundered above, spitting fire into the ridge, holding the enemy at bay. Yet the air was still filled with smoke and screams, and she knew any second could be her last. They reached the edge of the convoy where more rescuers were gathering soldiers, forming a rough line to cover the retreat. A medic rushed forward to help, but she shook her head, refusing to let go of Mason even as her own body begged for rest. She stumbled forward, dragging him into the waiting arms of the rescuers, only then allowing them to take his weight. She collapsed to her knees, blood streaming down her arm, chest heaving. But even on the ground, her eyes stayed on him, watching every breath, watching every flicker of life. The rescuers lifted Mason onto a stretcher, rushing him toward the helicopter, and she forced herself up, staggering after them, refusing to let him out of her sight. She limped across the battlefield, half blind, half deaf, but still fighting for every step. A blast behind her knocked her forward, face scraping against dirt, but she rose again, staggering. With stubborn fury, she would not fall now. Not when the end was so close. Not when Mason still breathed. At the ramp of the helicopter, chaos swirled, soldiers shouting, carrying the wounded, firing back into the valley. She stumbled aboard, gripping the frame with blood-slick hands. Mason was laid beside her, his chest rising shallow but steady. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead to his, whispering that he had made it, that they had both made it. The helicopter lifted, shaking as it pulled. Away from the valley, dust swirling below, the enemy fire growing distant, yet still clawing at her ears. As the ground fell away, she looked back through the open ramp at the burning wreckage, the twisted convoy, the smoke rising like a scar against the horizon. She thought of the moment she first picked up the rifle, of the vow she had broken, or perhaps transformed, and she wondered what she would be when the dust finally settled. She had entered the valley a medic carrying a kit and the promise of healing. She was leaving it, a fighter, blood on her hands and fire in her heart. Mason stirred again, eyes half open, and for the first time since the ambush began, she allowed herself to believe he might live. She gripped his hand tighter, whispering that he was safe now, even as tears blurred her vision. The soldier with the broken leg groaned beside them, but his eyes were alive, and he gave her a look of gratitude she could not answer. She only nodded,